The beginning of Evelyn's struggles. Evelyn Walker was the matriarch of the Walker family, a proud woman with a heart as big as the love she had for her family. At 76 years old, she had lived through more hardships and joys than most could imagine. Born in a small town in the South, Evelyn had seen her family through wars, the civil rights movement, and countless personal struggles. Her home had always been a place of refuge, where everyone knew they could find warmth, wisdom, and a plate full of soul food whenever they visited. Evelyn's children and grandchildren adored her, especially her only son, Marcus, who had a special bond with his mother. But time, as it does, had begun to take its toll on Evelyn. Though her mind was sharp and her spirit strong, her body had grown weaker. It started subtly, with a slower walk and an occasional stumble. Marcus, being the protective son he was, insisted on buying her a wheelchair to help her move around the house. Evelyn resisted at first, not wanting to admit that she needed assistance, but eventually she gave in. For a time, the wheelchair seemed like a blessing. It allowed Evelyn to keep her independence while remaining in the comfort of her own home. Marcus visited daily, making sure his mother had everything she needed. His teenage daughter, Amelia, spent her weekends at Grandma's, soaking up stories of old times and helping out around the house. Things were going well, or so it seemed, until the day Evelyn started having strange accidents. It began with a minor fall while she was trying to reach for a book on a high shelf. Marcus had just left the house when Evelyn tumbled out of her wheelchair, landing hard on the carpeted floor. It wasn't a bad fall, but enough to leave her shaken. When Marcus returned later that day, Evelyn was back in her chair, acting as though nothing had happened. She didn't tell him about the fall, not wanting to worry him. But when it happened again a few days later, she couldn't hide it. This time, Evelyn had fallen out of the wheelchair while trying to reach for the remote control. The fall was harder, leaving a nasty bruise on her arm. Marcus was beside himself with worry when he saw her. "Mama, you need to be more careful," he said gently, helping her back into the chair. "Maybe we should get you a more secure wheelchair or hire someone to come in and help during the day." But Evelyn was stubborn. "I'm fine, Marcus. Just getting old, that's all. I've been through worse." Marcus didn't push the issue. After all, his mother had always been strong, both physically and mentally. She had raised him and his sisters practically on her own after his father passed away when Marcus was just a boy. Evelyn wasn't one to complain. So Marcus let it go, figuring it was just a one-time thing. But then it happened again, and again. Over the next few weeks, Evelyn began falling out of her wheelchair more frequently. Sometimes it was when she reached for something. Other times, it seemed to happen for no reason at all. Marcus became increasingly worried. He took her to the doctor, but they couldn't find anything wrong. The wheelchair itself seemed fine, and Evelyn's reflexes, though slower with age, were still sharp enough to avoid these constant accidents. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something else was going on, something they were missing. His mother's health was deteriorating, and no one could explain why. It wasn't just the falls. Evelyn seemed more tired, more distant. Her once vibrant personality had dulled, and there were moments when she seemed lost in thought, as though she were carrying a burden too heavy to share. One evening, after yet another fall, Marcus sat down with his wife, Sheila, to talk about what they should do. "I don't know what's going on with her," he said, rubbing his temples in frustration. "She keeps falling, but the doctors say she's fine. It's like she's just giving up." Sheila frowned, her brow furrowing with concern. "Maybe it's just old age catching up with her, Marcus. She's been through a lot." "I know," Marcus replied, "but it doesn't feel right. Something's off. I've been thinking." He hesitated, glancing over at his mother's bedroom door. "Maybe I should install some cameras in the house, just to keep an eye on her. See if I can figure out what's going on when I'm not here." Sheila raised an eyebrow. "You really think that's necessary?" "I don't know. But I don't know what else to do. She's falling when I'm not around, and I can't be here all the time. I feel like there's more to this, and I can't shake the feeling that something's wrong." Sheila nodded slowly. "If it'll give you peace of mind, then do it. But you know how your mama is. She's not going to be happy if she finds out you're spying on her." "I won't let her know," Marcus said. "I just need to figure out what's going on. Maybe then we can get her the help she needs." The next day, while Evelyn was out for her weekly church meeting, Marcus installed small, discreet cameras in the main rooms of the house: the living room, the kitchen, and Evelyn's bedroom. He felt a pang of guilt as he did it, knowing that his mother would feel betrayed if she found out. But his worry for her outweighed his concerns about her privacy. He needed answers. For the first few days, nothing unusual happened. Evelyn went about her day as usual, spending her time reading, watching TV, and puttering around the house. Marcus checked the footage each night, but found nothing out of the ordinary. His mother seemed fine, aside from her usual slow movements. But then, on the fourth day, Marcus saw something on the footage that made his heart stop. It was late afternoon, and Evelyn was sitting in her wheelchair by the window, looking out at the garden. Marcus watched as she reached for the TV remote on the side table. Suddenly, the wheelchair jerked forward, as though someone had pushed it. Evelyn's body was thrown forward, and she tumbled to the ground. Marcus rewound the footage, his hands shaking. He watched it again, more closely this time. There was no one else in the room, no sign of anything that could have caused the wheelchair to move on its own. And yet it had. The movement was unnatural, almost as if someone had deliberately pushed it. He sat back, his mind racing. What was happening in his mother's house? Was it just a malfunction with the wheelchair, or was there something more sinister going on? Marcus couldn't shake the eerie feeling that something, or someone, was in the house with his mother, unseen but present. He didn't know what to think, but he knew one thing for sure. He had to get to the bottom of this, before something even worse happened to Evelyn. And so, with a heavy heart, Marcus resolved to keep watching. Whatever was happening in that house, he was determined to uncover the truth, no matter how painful or frightening it might be. The investigation begins. Marcus couldn't sleep that night. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion and dread, replaying the footage over and over in his head. How could Evelyn's wheelchair move on its own? Was there something wrong with the house, or was it all in his imagination? He had always been a logical man, never one to believe in the paranormal, but what he had seen with his own eyes defied explanation. The next morning, after making sure his mother was comfortable and settled with her breakfast, Marcus excused himself from the house. He needed to clear his head. As he drove through the quiet streets of the neighborhood, passing familiar houses and well-tended lawns, he felt a creeping unease. This was the same place he had grown up, the same place he had always felt safe. But now it felt different, like there was a shadow hanging over everything. He pulled up to the local hardware store, planning to ask about possible malfunctions with the wheelchair. Maybe there was a rational explanation after all. As he stepped inside, the familiar scent of metal and sawdust filled the air, but today it felt suffocating. "Morning, Marcus," the store owner, Hank, greeted him with a smile. Hank was an old friend of the family, someone who had known Evelyn since Marcus was a boy. "How's your mama doing?" Marcus hesitated, wondering how much to reveal. "She's okay, but I've been having some trouble with her wheelchair. It's been acting strange, like it's moving on its own." Hank's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Moving on its own? That's odd. You sure it's not just the brakes slipping or something?" "I don't know," Marcus admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. "That's why I'm here. I thought maybe it was a mechanical issue, but it doesn't seem like the kind of thing that would just happen out of the blue. The chair's not that old." Hank walked over to the section where they kept mobility aids and wheelchairs. "Well, let's see. Could be a lot of things. Faulty brakes, worn-out wheels, or maybe even a misalignment in the frame." "You got it checked recently?" "Yeah, I had it serviced just a few months ago," Marcus replied. "Everything was fine. But now it's like It's like something's pushing it. I don't know how else to explain it." Hank scratched his chin, looking thoughtful. "I don't want to sound like I'm dismissing what you saw, but sometimes when people get older, their balance changes in ways we don't expect. Your mama might be reaching for things differently, shifting her weight, and that could make the chair move if she's not careful." Marcus nodded, trying to take comfort in Hank's words, but something still gnawed at him. It wasn't just the chair's movement that bothered him. It was the way it happened, so suddenly and without warning, almost like a force had taken hold of it. "Thanks, Hank," Marcus said, forcing a smile. "I'll check it out when I get home." As he left the store, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than just a mechanical issue. He drove back to his mother's house, determined to keep a closer watch. Whatever was happening, he needed to figure it out before his mother got hurt again. When he arrived home, Marcus found Evelyn sitting in her favorite spot by the window, sipping her tea and watching the world go by. She looked peaceful, content even, but Marcus couldn't help but see her as fragile, a shadow of the strong woman he had always known. "Hey, Mama," he said, sitting down beside her. "How are you feeling today?" "Oh, I'm fine, baby," she replied with a smile. "Just enjoying the sunshine." "You worry too much." Marcus forced a chuckle. "I guess that's my job, isn't it?" Evelyn reached out and patted his hand. "I know you're worried about me, but I'm tougher than I look. You don't need to keep fussing over me like I'm some fragile thing. I'm just trying to make sure you're safe," Marcus said softly. "You've been having a lot of falls lately, and I don't want you to get hurt." Evelyn sighed, her expression turning somber. "I know, baby. It's frustrating, believe me. I feel like my body's betraying me. I reach for something, and the next thing I know, I'm on the floor. It's embarrassing." "It's not your fault, Mama," Marcus reassured her. "We're going to figure this out." That night, after Evelyn went to bed, Marcus sat down at his computer to review the footage again. He watched carefully, studying every movement, every small detail. For a while, everything seemed normal. But then, in the footage from earlier that day, something strange caught his eye. It was subtle at first, a slight flicker in the corner of the frame, almost imperceptible. Marcus rewound the footage and played it again, slowing it down. There, in the shadowy corner of the living room, something moved. It wasn't clear what it was, but it was there, a dark shape, shifting in the shadows just before Evelyn's wheelchair had jerked forward. Marcus's heart raced. Was it a trick of the light? He played the footage again, this time watching more closely. The shape was there, faint but undeniable, lingering in the background like an unwanted guest. "What the hell?" Marcus whispered to himself, his hands trembling as he paused the video. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen in disbelief. It wasn't possible. Nothing could explain what he had just seen. But there it was, clear as day. Something, or someone, was in the house with his mother. Over the next few days, Marcus became increasingly obsessed with the footage. He spent hours reviewing it, looking for patterns, clues, anything that could explain the strange occurrences. Each time Evelyn fell, there was that same dark shape, hovering just out of view. It moved quickly, almost imperceptibly, but it was always there. Marcus considered calling someone, a priest, a paranormal investigator, anyone who might know what to do in a situation like this. But he hesitated. What if he was wrong? What if it was just a camera glitch, or his imagination playing tricks on him? He couldn't bring himself to tell Sheila or the kids about what he had seen. They would think he was losing it, and maybe he was. But deep down, Marcus knew that something was terribly wrong. He could feel it in his bones, a creeping sense of dread that grew stronger with each passing day. One evening, after putting his mother to bed, Marcus decided to confront the situation head-on. He set up his laptop in the living room, keeping the camera feed open in front of him. Then he sat in the corner, watching and waiting. Hours passed, and nothing happened. The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards or the rustle of the wind outside. But Marcus remained vigilant, his eyes glued to the screen. And then, just after midnight, it happened. The room grew colder, the temperature dropping so suddenly that Marcus could see his breath. He looked around, heart pounding, but there was no one there, just the empty living room and the faint glow of the streetlights outside. Suddenly, the wheelchair moved. It was a small movement, barely noticeable, but Marcus saw it. The chair shifted forward, as though someone had pushed it, but there was no one there. Marcus stood up, his pulse racing. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice shaky. There was no answer, only silence. He approached the wheelchair cautiously, his hands trembling. As he reached out to touch it, the chair jerked forward again, this time with more force. Marcus stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest. In that moment he knew, this wasn't just a malfunction. This wasn't something he could explain away with logic or reason. Something, or someone, was in the house with them, and whatever it wasn't friendly. Marcus felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He needed to protect his mother, but how could he fight something he couldn't see? He didn't know what to do, but one thing was clear. This was just the beginning. Unseen forces and hidden secrets. Marcus sat in the darkened living room, his heart still pounding after the disturbing encounter with the unseen force. He had never believed in the supernatural, but now, with each passing day, he was forced to confront the undeniable truth. Something was wrong in his mother's house, and it wasn't just a malfunctioning wheelchair or a series of unfortunate accidents. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him heavily. How could he protect Evelyn from something he didn't even understand? He felt alone, as though the burden of his mother's safety rested entirely on his shoulders. But even as his mind raced with worry, one thing became clear. He couldn't keep this to himself anymore. The next morning, after a fitful few hours of sleep, Marcus sat down at the breakfast table with Sheila. He had wrestled all night with whether to tell her what he had witnessed. She deserved to know, but would she believe him? Would she think he had lost his mind? "Morning," Sheila said, setting a cup of coffee in front of him. "You look like you didn't sleep at all. What's going on?" Marcus took a deep breath, staring into his coffee. He couldn't delay any longer. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Sheila sat down across from him, her expression immediately shifting to concern. "What is it? Is it your mom?" "It's about the falls," Marcus began, trying to steady his voice. "I've been watching the footage from the cameras I installed, and something strange is happening." Sheila raised an eyebrow. "Strange how?" Marcus hesitated, the words catching in his throat. "The wheelchair, it's moving on its own. I don't know how to explain it. I've watched the footage over and over, and it's not my mom causing the falls. Something is pushing her." Sheila blinked, taken aback. "What do you mean something? Like a person? You think someone's sneaking into the house?" "No," Marcus said, shaking his head. "It's not a person. There's no one there. But I've seen these shadows, dark shapes, moving in the background. And last night, I was in the living room, and the wheelchair moved right in front of me. It wasn't just a malfunction. Something was there." Sheila's face softened with worry and confusion. She reached out, placing her hand over his. "Marcus, are you sure? I mean, shadows and moving chairs. It sounds like—" "I know how it sounds," Marcus interrupted, his voice tinged with frustration. "I didn't believe it either, but I saw it with my own eyes. It's real. Something is in that house with her." Sheila sat back, biting her lip as she processed what he was saying. Finally, she spoke, her voice measured. "Okay, let's say you're right. What do we do? Call someone? Who even handles something like this?" Marcus exhaled, relieved that she didn't dismiss him outright. "I don't know. I've been thinking about it all night. Maybe a priest or a paranormal investigator. I never thought I'd say this, but we might need someone who knows how to deal with this kind of thing." Sheila nodded slowly, though she still looked uncertain. Okay, let's take it one step at a time. Why don't we start by talking to someone who can give us more insight? I don't want to jump to conclusions, but if you're seeing something, we need to take it seriously. Marcus felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. He wasn't alone in this anymore. Together, they would find a way to keep Evelyn safe. That afternoon, Marcus made some calls. He found a local paranormal investigator named David Gentry, who had a reputation for being discreet and professional. When Marcus explained the situation over the phone, David didn't seem surprised. In fact, he spoke with a calm authority that reassured Marcus he wasn't the first person to deal with something unexplainable. "I'll come by tomorrow," David said. "I've seen cases like this before, and while I can't promise anything, I'll do my best to help you figure out what's going on." The following day, David arrived at the house, a tall man in his early 40s with a calm demeanor and a neatly trimmed beard. He carried a black bag full of equipment, which made Marcus wonder just how serious this was. As they sat down in the living room, David listened intently while Marcus explained everything. The falls, the shadows, the wheelchair moving on its own. "This is a classic case of what we call intelligent haunting," David explained. "It's when a spirit or entity has an awareness of its surroundings and interacts with the physical world. It sounds like whatever is here is making its presence known, but the fact that it's targeting your mother is concerning. Have you noticed any other strange occurrences besides the falls?" Marcus thought for a moment. "There have been some cold spots in the house, especially at night. And sometimes I feel like I'm being watched, but I figured it was just my nerves." David nodded. "That's common in these cases. Spirits often draw energy from their surroundings, causing temperature drops. The feeling of being watched can also be an indication that the entity is aware of you. Now, has your mother mentioned anything strange? Has she seen or heard anything?" Marcus frowned, realizing he hadn't asked his mother directly about it. "She hasn't said anything, but she's been distant lately. More tired than usual." David's expression darkened. "It's possible that the entity is draining her energy. Some spirits feed off the living in subtle ways. It's not always harmful, but in some cases, it can weaken the person over time." Marcus's stomach tightened at the thought. "So, what do we do?" David leaned forward, his tone serious. "The first step is identifying what kind of spirit we're dealing with. Not all hauntings are malicious, but some are. If this entity is responsible for the falls, it could be trying to harm your mother. I'll set up some equipment to measure electromagnetic activity and see if we can capture anything on camera. We might also try communicating with it to see what it wants." "Communicate with it?" Sheila, who had been sitting quietly, finally spoke up. "You mean, like a seance?" David smiled slightly. "Not quite. There are safer ways to make contact. I use a method called EVP, electronic voice phenomena. We'll record audio in the house and ask questions. Sometimes, spirits will respond in ways we can't hear in real time, but the recording will pick it up." Marcus felt a knot of anxiety in his chest. This was all becoming too real. He had hoped for a simple solution, maybe even a technical explanation, but now they were talking about direct communication with whatever was haunting his mother's house. David spent the next few hours setting up his equipment in the living room, kitchen, and Evelyn's bedroom. He placed small cameras and motion sensors in strategic locations, explaining that they would capture any unusual movement or changes in temperature. He also set up an audio recorder for the EVP session, which they would conduct later that evening. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the house, David gathered Marcus and Sheila in the living room for the EVP session. Evelyn had already gone to bed, and Marcus was relieved she wouldn't be part of this. He didn't want her to know how serious things had gotten. David dimmed the lights, creating an eerie atmosphere in the room. He turned on the audio recorder and placed it on the coffee table. "We're going to ask the entity some questions," he explained softly. "We'll pause between each one to give it a chance to respond. Remember, it may not happen in real time. We'll have to listen to the recording later to hear if anything comes through. Marcus nodded, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. He wasn't sure if he wanted to hear the answers. David started the session, his voice calm and measured. Is there anyone here with us? If so, can you tell us your name? Silence. Why are you here? What do you want? Silence again, the stillness of the house pressing in on them. Are you trying to harm Evelyn? A shiver ran down Marcus's spine. He held his breath, waiting, but there was no sound. After a few more questions, David turned off the recorder. That's all we can do for now, David said. I'll review the recording and the footage tonight, and we'll see if anything comes through. In the meantime, I suggest you keep a close eye on your mother. If things escalate, we may need to consider bringing in a priest for a cleansing. Marcus nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and dread. He had hoped for answers, but now, the idea of confirming a malevolent presence in the house filled him with fear. That night, as Marcus lay in bed, his mind raced. He kept thinking about the entity, what it wanted, why it was targeting his mother, and whether they could stop it. The house was quiet, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Somewhere in the darkness, something was watching, waiting. And it wasn't finished yet. The haunting deepens. The days after the EVP session felt like a waiting game. Marcus, Sheila, and David tried to go about their daily lives, but the atmosphere in the house had changed. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind through the trees outside, seemed to carry a sense of tension. Marcus found it hard to focus at work, the unease gnawing at him, reminding him that whatever was in the house had yet to reveal its full intentions. The day after David's visit, Marcus sat in the living room, the sunlight filtering through the curtains, casting pale yellow light on the worn-out furniture. It was late afternoon, and Evelyn was napping in her room. The house was still and quiet, save for the occasional murmur of the wind outside. Marcus had spent the morning reviewing the footage from the hidden cameras. There was nothing overt, no sudden movements of objects, no eerie shadows moving in the background. But as he watched, something strange caught his eye. In the footage from the previous evening, when Evelyn had been sitting in her wheelchair near the window, Marcus noticed a faint shift in the light. At first, it was too subtle to make sense of, but after rewinding the footage several times, he realized it wasn't a trick of the camera. It was as though the light itself had bent around her, distorting in some invisible way. The effect was so subtle it could easily be missed, but there it was, a sign of something unnatural. Marcus's stomach tightened. He had hoped that the cameras and the EVP session would bring clarity, but so far, all he had were more questions. Was this spirit, or whatever it was, trying to communicate? Was it trying to tell them something? Or was it just waiting for the right moment to reveal its full power? At that moment, Sheila entered the room, holding a cup of coffee. She could tell something was bothering him by the tense look on his face. "Marcus," she said gently, sitting down beside him. "What are you thinking?" He sighed, rubbing his forehead. "I don't know, Sheila. I keep looking at this footage, and it's like something is trying to mess with our heads. The shadows, the strange distortion in the light, it all feels so calculated. I don't know how to explain it." Sheila leaned in closer, her voice soft. "Do you think it's trying to send a message, or is it just playing with us?" Marcus shook his head, feeling the weight of the situation press down on him. "I don't know. Maybe it's both. But whatever it is, it's getting stronger. I can feel it." Sheila reached out and took his hand in hers. "We're going to get through this. David's going to help us, and we'll figure it out together." Marcus nodded, but he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was about to happen. The unease had grown, and it wasn't just in the house. It was in him. It was as if the very air around him had thickened with an unspoken warning. That evening after dinner, Marcus and Sheila sat down with David once again to review the results of the EVP session. They had decided to meet at the house again, as the tension in the air was too thick to ignore. Evelyn, thankfully, was resting in her room, completely unaware of the ongoing investigation. David set up his laptop and began playing the audio from the recording. The static noise of the room, the occasional hum of the refrigerator, and the distant rustle of the trees outside filled the speakers, but it was the subtle sounds that they were listening for. The moments of silence between the questions were just as important as the answers. After a few moments of listening, David's face remained calm, but his brow furrowed slightly. "I think I've found something," David said quietly, leaning closer to the laptop. "Listen here." The room fell into a tense silence as the three of them listened intently to the audio. At first, it was barely noticeable, just a whisper, almost drowned out by static. But as David increased the volume, the faint words became clearer. "Help me," came a soft, echoing voice. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. Sheila's eyes widened in disbelief. David replayed the recording, the words now unmistakable. "Help me." Did it just say something? Sheila asked, her voice shaking. "It did," David replied, his tone even but heavy with the weight of the discovery. "It's asking for help. The entity that's in this house, it's not just here to harm Evelyn. It's here because it's trapped. It's asking for help to move on." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. This wasn't what he had expected. All the previous signs had pointed towards something malevolent, something that had been attacking his mother. But this voice, this message, seemed different. It wasn't a threat. It was a plea for help. David turned to Marcus and Sheila. "This changes things. I believe this spirit, if that's what it is, may not be the source of the falls. The falls could be a result of it trying to make contact. This entity may be trying to communicate with Evelyn in the only way it knows how." Marcus swallowed hard. "So, what does that mean?" "It's trying to use my mother to get help." David nodded. "It's possible. Sometimes spirits get stuck in a place because they have unresolved issues. If this spirit was connected to something traumatic, something it couldn't deal with in life, it might be trying to reach out to someone who can help it move on." Sheila's face went pale. "But why her? Why Evelyn?" "That," David said, pausing, "is the part we need to figure out. Spirits often attach themselves to people who are emotionally vulnerable or connected to events from their past. It's possible Evelyn's presence here, or her experiences in life, are resonating with this spirit in some way." Marcus felt a strange mix of relief and dread. If the entity was asking for help, then maybe they could solve this peacefully. But if it wasn't, if it had malicious intent, they were walking a fine line between danger and salvation. "What do we do now?" Marcus asked, his voice low. David closed the laptop and stood up. "We need to do a cleansing. A ritual to help the spirit find peace and move on. But before we do that, we need to learn more about the spirit. We need to figure out who it was in life and why it's here." For the next few days, David and Marcus worked together, researching the history of the house. David combed through old records, while Marcus visited the local library, speaking to elderly neighbors who had lived in the area for decades. They discovered that the house had once belonged to an elderly couple named Harold and Alice Hughes, who had lived there for over 50 years. Harold had passed away suddenly in his sleep, and Alice had followed soon after, a few months later. The community had never spoken much about them, but some neighbors recalled that Alice had been a bit of a recluse in her later years, and there were whispers that Harold had been a difficult man. Could this spirit be Harold? Marcus wondered. Or could it be Alice, reaching out from beyond to communicate with Evelyn? On the 4th day of their investigation, Marcus was going through some old letters that had been stored in the attic when he stumbled upon a photograph. It was black and white, faded with age, but there was no mistaking the woman in the photo. It was Alice Hughes. She was seated in a wheelchair, her face stern, her eyes distant. The photograph sent a shiver down Marcus's spine. He brought the photo to David, and the two of them stared at it for a long moment. "That's her," David said quietly. "That's the woman in the photo. Alice Hughes." Marcus nodded. She looks just like Evelyn. Maybe that's why the spirit is attached to her. David took a deep breath. It's possible. Alice may have been trying to make contact with Evelyn all along, but we still don't know why. They had their answer, but the haunting was far from over. Alice Hughes was here, and now Marcus had to figure out how to help her find peace. But in doing so, he couldn't shake the feeling that something darker was still lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The unveiling of the past. The days following the discovery of Alice Hughes's photograph felt heavy with an ominous sense of foreboding. Marcus and Sheila had spoken little about it, each processing the revelation in their own way. They knew that the spirit haunting their home had to be Alice Hughes, but the question that lingered in their minds was why. Why had Alice, an elderly woman who passed away so many years ago, become so attached to their home, and to Evelyn in particular? David, too, seemed lost in thought. He had been helping Marcus with the research, sifting through old letters and newspaper clippings, hoping to find a clue that would explain the connection between Alice and Evelyn. Yet, as he combed through the records, nothing about Alice's life seemed to hint at this strange, powerful attachment. It was late one afternoon when Marcus made the final, unsettling connection. He was sitting at the kitchen table, staring down at the old family album containing Alice's photograph, the edges worn and frayed from age. He felt a strange pull toward the image, something about the way Alice's eyes seemed to follow him. "What are you thinking about, Marcus?" Sheila's voice interrupted the silence, and Marcus looked up to find his wife standing in the doorway. "I keep thinking about this," he said, gesturing to the photo. "Alice Hughes. Why her? She lived here for over 50 years, and then she just faded away. But something about her death doesn't sit right with me." Sheila frowned. "You don't think she was trying to reach out because of something unresolved in her life?" Marcus nodded, feeling the weight of the question. "I think it's more than just that. The connection to Evelyn. It's too strong. There's something more here, something I haven't been able to piece together." Sheila stepped into the room and took a seat next to him. "Do you think Alice's death had something to do with the house? Maybe the place itself has some dark energy." Marcus ran a hand through his hair, staring at the photo. "I'm starting to wonder if the house is part of the problem. This place is old, Sheila. It's seen a lot of history. Maybe Alice is trapped here. And maybe she's trying to find someone like Evelyn, who can help her move on." Just as Marcus was about to speak further, a loud creak came from upstairs, followed by the sound of Evelyn's wheelchair rolling across the floor. It was the first time in days that the old chair had moved on its own, but this time it wasn't just the creak of the wood. The sound was deliberate, as though someone was pushing the chair, gently, but with purpose. Marcus and Sheila exchanged a glance, their expressions filled with the same mix of dread and determination. Without a word, they both stood and rushed upstairs, Marcus gripping the banister as they made their way down the narrow hallway to Evelyn's bedroom. The door to Evelyn's room was slightly ajar, and as they approached, Marcus could hear the faint hum of the wheelchair. The air in the hallway had grown thick and cold, like the presence of someone, or something, was hanging in the air. When Marcus pushed open the door, he froze. Evelyn's wheelchair sat at the foot of her bed, but no one was in it. The room was eerily still, and the window, which had been closed earlier in the day, was now cracked open just a few inches. "I didn't touch the window," Sheila whispered, her voice trembling as she stepped into the room. Marcus walked in behind her, scanning the area. "Evelyn." Marcus called out quietly, though he knew she wasn't in the room. "Mama." There was no answer. The room was silent again, save for the soft swish of the curtains as the wind blew through the open window. But then, as Marcus turned to leave, he heard it. A faint voice, barely more than a whisper, calling from the darkness of the room. "Help me." The voice was distorted, as if coming from a long way away, but there was no mistaking it. It was Alice. Marcus felt his heart stop. It was like a rush of cold air had seeped into the room, the temperature dropping suddenly as the presence of the spirit filled the space. The next moment, the air shifted again, the familiar warmth returning. Sheila's hand tightened around Marcus's arm, her voice shaky. "We have to get her," she whispered. "Evelyn, she's not safe here." Marcus nodded, his pulse racing. Without another word, they bolted out of the room and headed toward the staircase. They found Evelyn sitting in the hallway, her wheelchair positioned near the top of the stairs, her eyes wide and filled with confusion. "What's wrong, Mama?" Marcus asked, kneeling in front of her, trying to calm her. Evelyn blinked, as though waking from a daze. I was just in my room," she said, her voice slow. "I felt like someone was calling me. I went to the window, and then Then what?" Sheila asked, bending down beside Evelyn. "I don't know," Evelyn murmured, shaking her head. "It was like I couldn't move. I heard someone crying. But it wasn't you, Marcus. It wasn't you, Sheila. It was someone else." Marcus's stomach tightened. The pieces were falling into place. Evelyn had heard Alice calling out, the same way the EVP session had captured it. Alice was trying to make contact. "We need to get you out of here, Mama," Marcus said softly. "Come on. Let's go downstairs." As they carefully helped Evelyn back into her wheelchair and led her downstairs, Marcus glanced over his shoulder at the hallway, where the shadows seemed to stretch longer than usual. Something about this whole experience was shifting. The more they tried to uncover the truth, the closer they were getting to something far more dangerous than they had originally anticipated. That night, as Marcus lay awake in bed, he replayed everything that had happened. The strange noises, the whispers, the movements in the house. He had been so focused on Alice and the connection she had with Evelyn that he hadn't stopped to think about something else. The dark history of the house itself. The whispers in the night, the chill in the air, the way Evelyn had been drawn to the window. It all pointed to something deeper than just a lonely spirit. There was something dark within the walls of the house, something more than Alice. It was as if the house itself held memories of pain, loss, and grief that refused to be forgotten. As the night grew darker, Marcus could feel the weight of those memories pressing in around him, like invisible hands pulling him deeper into the house's past. The following morning, he told Sheila about his growing fears. "I think the house itself is haunted, not just by Alice," he said, his voice low. "There's something here that's been festering for years, maybe even generations. It's like a curse, something that's trapped all of us, Evelyn, Alice, and now, us too." Sheila listened silently, her face etched with concern. "What do we do, Marcus? If the house is part of it, how do we fix it?" Marcus didn't have an answer. All he knew was that they had to stop whatever was happening before it consumed them all. The spirit of Alice Hughes may have been seeking peace, but something darker was lurking beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. "I don't know," he finally admitted, "but I think it's time we dig deeper into this house's history. We need to know what's been hidden here for all these years." And as they sat there, the distant sound of footsteps creaking down the hallway seemed to echo through the house, as though the walls themselves were aware that their dark secrets were about to be unearthed. The fight to free Evelyn and the house itself was far from over. The House of Forgotten Secrets. The following days were clouded with a sense of dread, one that seemed to seep into the very walls of the Johnson family home. As Marcus and Sheila continued their search for answers, the house itself felt like a living, breathing entity, as if it were watching them. The creaks of the floorboards became more pronounced, the shadows lengthened, and at times, there were whispers, soft, indistinct murmurs that echoed through the hallways when no one else was there. Marcus, restless and on edge, had thrown himself into the research. He spent hours scouring old town records, speaking with neighbors who had lived near the house for decades, and even visiting the local historical society. He learned that the Johnson home had a long, troubled history, dating back to its construction in the late 1800s. At first, it had been a grand estate, a symbol of wealth and prestige. But over the years, the house had been passed down through several owners, many of whom had met tragic ends. It was as if the house itself had absorbed the pain, grief, and loss that had occurred within its walls. One evening, while Marcus was going through a box of old letters and photographs in the attic, he stumbled upon something that caught his eye. A worn, yellowed letter tucked into an old chest. It was dated October 1923. The handwriting was elegant but shaky, a stark contrast to the otherwise pristine letters around it. "Dearest Alice," it began, "I fear I will not be able to endure the weight of this place much longer. The house, it whispers in the night. I swear I can feel its eyes on me, watching me when I least expect it. I have tried to leave, but every time I make an attempt, someone, always pulls me back. I fear that this home is cursed, Alice, and if I stay, I too will become part of its dark history." Marcus's heart pounded as he read through the rest of the letter, which spoke of the unsettling experiences of a woman named Clara, a previous resident of the house. Clara had lived in the house with her husband and child, but over time, she began to deteriorate mentally, haunted by the house's sinister presence. The letter detailed how Clara had believed that the house was cursed, that the spirits of those who had died there were trapped, and that they were all bound to the home, doomed to relive their final moments of pain and sorrow. But there was more. The final paragraph of the letter mentioned Alice Hughes. "Alice, I have tried to speak to the spirit that haunts this place. I believe it is the spirit of a woman who died long ago, consumed by grief. She is angry, but also lost, and I fear that she will not rest until she finds someone to take her place. You must leave, Alice, while you still can." The letter was signed, Clara. Marcus felt a cold chill run down his spine as the weight of the letter's contents settled in. It was as if the words were a direct warning to him, a message that had been buried in time, waiting for the right person to uncover it. Alice Hughes had been a part of this dark history long before Marcus and his family had moved in. She had been connected to the spirit that had haunted Clara, and possibly many others who had come before them. His mind raced with the implications. The house wasn't just a witness to Alice's death. It was a participant in the cycle of suffering. The curse that Clara spoke of wasn't just a memory. It was alive, and it had been feeding on the pain and fear of those who had lived within these walls. That night, after Marcus shared his findings with Sheila, they both sat in silence, staring into the flickering flames of the fireplace. Evelyn had been moved to a temporary room downstairs, away from the increasingly disturbing occurrences in the house. They had done everything they could to keep her safe, but it was clear that the house itself was part of the problem. The walls held a malevolent energy, one that could not be ignored. "I can't believe it," Sheila whispered, her voice trembling. "It's like the house has been feeding off the grief and pain for decades. Alice, she's not just a spirit looking for peace. She's trapped, and the house won't let her go." Marcus nodded, his face grim. "And the more we stay here, the more we're feeding into it. It's like it's waiting for us to unravel so it can claim us." "We have to end this," Sheila said, her voice firm with determination. "We have to free Alice and Evelyn before it's too late." Marcus agreed, but he knew that the task ahead was no small feat. He had to find a way to break the cycle, to sever the house's hold on Alice and everyone who had lived there. And he knew that the key to it all lay in understanding the full history of the house, its dark past, and the spirits that had once walked its halls. The next morning, Marcus and Sheila visited the local town historian, a woman named Ruth Harris, who had lived in the town her whole life. Ruth had an encyclopedic knowledge of the area's history, and she had been especially interested in the Johnson house, which had a reputation for being haunted. When they arrived at Ruth's home, she greeted them warmly, though her eyes held a certain wariness when they mentioned the house. "I knew this day would come," Ruth said softly as she led them into her cluttered study, which was lined with books, old photographs, and maps of the town. "That house has always been trouble. People who lived there, they never stayed long. And the ones who did, well, They always left with something broken inside. Marcus nodded. We know. We felt it. But we need to understand why. Why is the house like this? Why has it haunted so many? Ruth sighed and sat down behind her desk. There's a story no one wants to talk about. You see, before Alice Hughes lived there, the house had been built by a family called the Crawfords. They were wealthy, well-respected, but something went wrong. Their daughter, Margaret, fell ill. No one knew what was wrong with her, but as she grew weaker, the house began to change. The air became heavy, oppressive, and soon after, Margaret died. The Crawfords were devastated, and rumors started circulating that Margaret's spirit had never left the house. Marcus and Sheila exchanged a look, their hearts sinking. But it wasn't just Margaret, Ruth continued. Over the years, several others who lived in the house fell ill, and the house's reputation grew darker. It was as though the energy there had a life of its own, preying on those who stayed too long. The Crawfords, it said, tried to leave, but they were never able to. They died within its walls, their bodies withering away as though the house was sucking the life out of them. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. Alice Hughes was the last to live there. She was one of the few who didn't leave, but she was different. She was drawn to the house, almost as if it had claimed her. And now you're here, caught in the same cycle. Marcus felt a shiver run down his spine. The house was more than just a haunted building. It was a curse. And now, Alice's spirit, along with the echoes of the Crawford family and others, were bound to it. That night, Marcus and Sheila gathered their family together, including Evelyn, who had been too frightened to return to her room. The house was no longer a place of comfort. It had become a battlefield between the living and the dead, and they all knew it. We have to do something, Marcus said, his voice resolute. We can't let the house claim anyone else. We have to find a way to break the curse. But how? Sheila asked, her voice thick with fear. I think I know, Marcus said, standing up. He reached for the photograph of Alice Hughes that had been haunting him. It's about understanding the history, the people who came before us. We have to find a way to give them peace, to let go of this place. Evelyn, her voice shaking but steady, spoke up. We've been running from it. But maybe it's time we face it head on. Marcus nodded. They had to confront the house's past, its pain, its suffering. Only then could they hope to free Alice, and themselves, from the grip of the darkness that had taken hold. The house was waiting, watching, and the final confrontation was approaching.